Greetings to everyone. Welcome back once again to my educational channel on biology. I'm teacher Janet. In this video, we're going to study the topic oogenesis, which is the production of the ovum. So this topic is found in chapter 15 of the biology Form 5 KSSM syllabus, subtopic 15.2, but it can also be used for the IGCSE syllabus and other syllabuses that are relevant. So the human egg or ovum is found in the ovary, and as seen here, this is the ovary and this is the secondary oocyte or the immature ovum. It is the largest cell in the human body with a diameter of about 0.1 mm. So on the average, a woman will ovulate or release about 400 to 500 of these eggs in her lifetime. Let's discover more interesting secrets about oogenesis. The learning standards for this video are as follows. 15.2 Gametogenesis in humans. After this lesson, we should be able to describe gamete formation, that is oogenesis, which is the formation of the female gamete, that is the ovum. Secondly, we should be able to identify the structure of the female gamete, which is the secondary oocyte, as seen here, with its cytoplasm nucleus and the plasma membrane surrounding it. Apart from that, there are also follicular cells surrounding the female gamete or the secondary oocyte, okay, called the follicular cells. Next, we'll compare and contrast spermatogenesis and oogenesis. So the two types of gametogenesis are spermatogenesis, which is the process of sperm production that occurs in the seminiferous tubules of the testes. This was discussed in the previous video. And next, there's oogenesis, which is the process of ovum or secondary oocyte production that occurs in the ovary. So we are going to discuss this today. So in the previous videos, we have discussed the structure of the female reproductive system. In this video, we're going to focus on the ovary, in which oogenesis is carried out. So the ovary is the female reproductive organ that produces ova, that means the ovum, and hormones estrogen and progesterone. Okay, and this is the fallopian tube where the secondary oocyte or immature ovum will be released into during ovulation. So here's an important note on oogenesis. That is what you need to know about oogenesis. So I've broken down the video into 4 stages, A, B, C, D, to help you to understand each stage better, all right, and to understand the whole process more easily. Now, the basic process of oogenesis is the first thing that we will discuss, and the age of the female at each stage of oogenesis. For example, in the fetus, the primordial germ cells undergo mitosis many times to form many oogonia, and each oogonium then develops and grows to form the primary oocytes. Okay, then the primary oocytes begin meiosis 1 but stops at the prophase 1 stage of meiosis 1. All this occurs in the fetus. All right. Then when the baby girl is born, there are many primary oocytes, and the primary oocytes will have to wait 12 years before they resume and complete meiosis 1. So at puberty, the primary oocytes complete meiosis 1 to form the secondary oocytes in the ovary. And then the secondary oocytes continue with meiosis 2 but stop at the metaphase 2 stage of meiosis, okay, in the ovary. Then ovulation occurs when the secondary oocyte is released from the ovary. Okay, then secondary oocyte will complete meiosis 2 if the sperm penetrates the secondary oocyte in the fallopian tube, and then the ovum is formed. Okay, so basically this is the process of oogenesis and the different stages. Now, secondly, we are going to find out what are the 3 types of follicles inside the ovary which enclose the oocytes, and what is the corpus luteum. So here we can see the primary follicle. Okay, this is the first type of follicle. A, primary follicle, B, secondary follicle, and C, Graafian follicle. Follicle is just an egg bag or egg sac that contains the oocyte. The oocyte here, cyte means cell, it's the cell, the female gamete. So when the Graafian follicle has burst or ruptured and released the secondary oocyte into the fallopian tube, Then the remains of the graphene follicle is called the corpus luteum. So it is not a useless structure. It can secrete the hormone progesterone, which regulates the menstrual cycle. Okay, so we're going to discuss more about this in the next few slides. Now, after you've studied B, then when you go to C, it's much easier. You'll be able to understand the structure of the ovary with the 3 types of follicles in it and the corpus luteum. Now, finally, we are going to recap and discuss when meiosis stops and resumes again in oogenesis. So oogenesis is not a continuous process, unlike spermatogenesis. For oogenesis, meiosis starts and then stops, and then starts and then stops again. Okay? So meiosis 1 first starts in the fetal stage to the primary oocyte, but it stops when the primary oocyte is at the prophase 1 stage of meiosis 1. Okay, meiosis 1 will stop there. It's not completed yet. Then 12 years later, in the girl, okay, when puberty is reached, meiosis 1 resumes and completes. Okay, that means the primary oocyte will complete meiosis 1 to form the secondary oocyte in the ovary. Okay, this cell here. Then the secondary oocyte will begin meiosis 2. It continues with meiosis 2, but again, it stops at the stage of metaphase 2 of meiosis 2. Okay, then after that, the secondary oocyte is released from the ovary, from the graphene follicle in the ovary. Then meiosis 2 only resumes when fertilization occurs in the fallopian tube. That is when if there's a sperm that penetrates the secondary oocyte. Okay, then meiosis 2 resumes and is completed, and finally the ovum is produced. Just before the fertilization process whereby the nucleus of the sperm fuses with the nucleus of the ovum. So first of all, we're going to discuss the process of oogenesis. I'll give you the summary first so that you have a basic understanding of the different stages of oogenesis before we go on to the more complex details, right? So let's start. Now, in oogenesis, which is the formation of the ovum, all right, or the secondary oocyte, first of all, there are primordial germ cells in the ovaries, in the fetus, okay, in the fetus, and these are diploid cells. So the primordial germ cells in the ovary of the fetus undergoes mitosis to form many oogonia, which are diploid. Singular is one oogonium. The oogonia undergo growth and development to become primary oocytes, which are also diploid. So at birth, the baby girl has many primary oocytes, all right? But the primary oocytes have to wait 12 years or until puberty hits, or puberty is attained by the girl, around 12 years old, at around 12 years old, okay? Then they continue their development. So the primary oocyte will undergo meiosis 1 to form the secondary oocyte, all right? Which is haploid. So this is the first time that the cell is haploid, when meiosis 1 occurs. Okay, it's always after meiosis 1 that the cell turns haploid. Okay, from a diploid cell, it becomes a haploid cell. Next, the secondary oocyte will undergo meiosis, will complete meiosis 2 if there's fertilization, and then it will become an ovum, and then the ovum will, the nucleus of the ovum will fuse with the nucleus of the sperm to form the zygote, right? So we have to remember the different stages of oogenesis, and our memory tip is POP. So P for primordial germ cell, O is for oogonium, another P for primary oocyte, S for secondary oocyte, and O for ovum. Apart from that, you have to remember the processes involved, like mitosis, growth, and development, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. And we also have to know whether the cell is diploid or haploid. It is diploid for the first 3 stages, and then it becomes a haploid cell. Okay, so notice that here there is no differentiation involved as compared with spermatogenesis, where the spermatid will undergo differentiation to form the sperm. Okay, for the ovum, it doesn't undergo that type of differentiation. Okay. So now let's discuss the more detailed process of oogenesis. Now, firstly, in oogenesis, the primordial germ cells in the fetus in the mother will divide by mitosis many times to produce many oogonia. The singular form of oogonia is oogonium, right? So this is called the multiplication stage, right? Next, each oogonium grows bigger and develops into a diploid primary oocyte. So this is the primary oocyte, and it is surrounded by layers of follicular cells to form a primary follicle, which we will study later. Okay, so the primary follicle is an egg bag that contains the primary oocyte. Next, the follicle is stimulated to grow by a hormone called FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, continue. The primary oocyte in the fetus now undergoes meiosis 1, but the process stops at prophase 1, okay, during the development of the fetus. Next, the primary oocyte will be at the stage of prophase 1 of meiosis, when the baby is born. And from birth until before puberty, that means about for 12 years, the primary oocyte remains in this condition, all right? And it will be waiting for the stage of puberty to occur. When the girl obtains or attains puberty, then the process continues. The process of meiosis 1 continues. So at birth, a baby girl has millions of these primary oocytes that remain dormant or inactive in the prophase 1 stage of meiosis 1. Then from birth through to infant stage and childhood stage, and then to puberty, during this time the number of oocytes decreases, all right? So the number of oocytes decreases from birth to puberty. Now, when puberty is reached at about 12 years old, due to the increase in certain types of hormones like follicle stimulating hormone, the primary oocyte will complete meiosis 1. That means it will continue to divide or continue to carry out meiosis 1 from prophase 1 to metaphase 1, anaphase 1, and telophase 1, right? And then the primary oocyte will divide to form two cells. One is the smaller polar body, which is called the first polar body. It is non-functional, and it will later degenerate and die, or die and degenerate. And then the other cell formed from the primary oocyte is a bigger cell called the secondary oocyte. This is the immature ovum. It will become the ovum later on, if there's fertilization, right? So the secondary oocyte is the important cell, and it then continues with meiosis 2. After meiosis 1, secondary oocyte is formed. Now secondary oocyte undergoes meiosis 2, but it stops at metaphase 2 of meiosis 2. All right? Then after that, this secondary oocyte is released from the ovum during ovulation, and it is released into the fallopian tube through the process of ovulation. Then it will travel through the fallopian tube. Now, if it meets the sperms or a sperm that penetrates it, then meiosis 2 will be completed, whereby the secondary oocyte will go through meiosis 2. That means you carry on from metaphase 2 to anaphase 2 and telophase 2, and then the cell will divide into two to form one smaller polar body that's non-functional and a bigger cell called the ovum. So this is the female gamete, right? That's matured. Now, this only occurs if a sperm penetrates the secondary oocyte, okay? Sperm penetrates the secondary oocyte in the fallopian tube, then only the ovum is formed, all right? So let's read from here. The secondary oocyte only completes meiosis 2 to form the ovum if a sperm penetrates it in the fallopian tube while it is in the fallopian tube. Then after that, when the ovum is formed, the nucleus of the ovum will fuse with the nucleus of the sperm in order to form a diploid zygote and to form the new offspring. So in the flow chart on oogenesis, we see the symbol 2N or N. So what is 2N or N? Now, 2N means that the cell is a diploid cell. It has two sets of chromosomes in the cell. One set is from the father, called the paternal chromosomes, and one set is from the mother, called the maternal chromosomes. So for humans, this means that there are 46 chromosomes in the cell, in the diploid cell. Okay, so primordial germ cells, oogonia, and primary oocytes all are diploid cells with 46 chromosomes in them, in the human body. Now, how about the secondary oocyte? Secondary oocyte is produced after meiosis 1 and it is a haploid cell. So haploid cell means that there's only one set of chromosomes in the cell, all right? And this set of chromosomes has a mix of the genes from the father and the mother, okay, because crossing over has occurred in meiosis 1. So for humans, this means that there are 23 chromosomes in the cell, okay? So the secondary oocyte and the ovum all have 23 chromosomes per cell, all right? So these are the notes on oogenesis as what we have discussed in the previous slides, right? Our learning standard here is going to be answered, that is, describe oogenesis in humans, 8 marks. So this can be an essay question or can be part of a structured question too, all right? So let's look at the answer. Now, formation of ovum or process of oogenesis. So oogenesis is defined as the process whereby an ovum or a secondary oocyte, which is the female gamete, is formed. Oogenesis begins in the ovary of a female fetus before birth. Now, before birth, when the fetus is in the uterus of the mother, the primordial germ cells that are diploid in the ovary of the fetus undergo mitosis many times to produce many oogonia, which are also diploid. Singular form is oogonium. Next, an oogonium grows and develops into a diploid primary oocyte. Each primary oocyte is surrounded by layers of follicular cells to form a primary follicle, which we will discuss later, right, in the next section. Number 3, the growth of the follicle is stimulated by the follicle stimulating hormone. So this hormone is produced by the fetus right from the start, right? So right from the time that it is formed, right? It is conceived, and then when the fetus is a few months older, the fetus will start secreting the follicle stimulating hormone, okay, to stimulate the growth of the follicle. Now, the primary oocyte in the fetus then undergoes meiosis 1, but the process stops at prophase 1 during fetal development. So, after birth, from baby stage to puberty, 12 years. O. At birth, a baby girl has millions of the primary oocytes, which are diploid, that remain dormant or inactive in the prophase 1 stage of meiosis 1. So the number of these primary oocytes will decrease at puberty because some of them will die and degenerate. Now at puberty, around 12 years old, the primary oocyte completes meiosis 1. That means it continues to undergo metaphase 1, anaphase 1, and telophase 1 to form the secondary oocyte, which is haploid, and a first polar body, right? So this process occurs because of the stimulation by hormones like FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. Now, number 6, secondary oocyte then begins meiosis 2, but it halts or stops at metaphase 2. All right, so meiosis 2 stops and isn't completed. Then the secondary oocyte will only complete meiosis 2. That means it will carry on with anaphase 2 and telophase 2 once a sperm penetrates it in the fallopian tube. Okay, this occurs in the fallopian tube, and the product will be an ovum and a polar body. And then this will be followed by fertilization, where the nucleus of the sperm will fuse with the nucleus of the ovum, okay, to form the in order to form the zygote. Now, the first polar body, okay, as from here, from number 5 here, also undergoes meiosis 2, so it will divide to form 2 more polar bodies. All these are non-functional. They will just degenerate. They will just die and degenerate. Okay. So in this picture here, we see the stages in the growth of the girl, a girl or a female. So at birth, then at infant stage to childhood stage, that means 0 to 12 years, there are many primary oocytes already in the prophase 1 stage of meiosis 1. Alright, so no more primary oocytes will be produced, okay, in the ovaries for this, for the girl here. Now after that, the girl will grow up, and at 12 years of age, she will attain puberty. So there will be release of greater amounts of this FSH. Then the primary oocytes will complete meiosis 1 to form the secondary oocyte. Right? Then secondary oocyte will start meiosis 2, but it will stop at the metaphase 2 stage. So meiosis 2 will only be completed if the sperm penetrates the secondary oocyte. Then the ovum will be formed, and then fertilization will occur. So we have already discussed oogenesis. Now you can test yourself by trying this small quiz here. Just fill in the blanks with the right term. So you can pause the video and start answering the questions here, or fill in the blanks, and we will discuss the answers in a short while. Right, let's look at the answers. Now, the process of ovum formation is called oogenesis. It is not a continuous process. It starts in the female fetus in the mother's uterus, where primary oocytes are formed from oogonia. Number 4, the primary oocytes remain dormant at prophase 1 stage of meiosis when the baby girl is born. Next, the process of ovum formation continues once the girl reaches puberty at about 12 years of age. And this process of ovum formation stops during menopause at around 50 years of age in females. Now, during puberty, in every menstrual cycle of the female that lasts 28 days, a primary oocyte will complete meiosis 1 to form a secondary oocyte in the ovary. The secondary oocyte then undergoes meiosis 2, but stops at the metaphase 2 stage. Next, it is released from the ovary into the fallopian tube during the process of ovulation. We have already finished discussing the process of oogenesis. Now let's find out, what is a follicle? So a follicle is actually an egg sac or an egg bag. It is a small bag in the ovary that contains the egg. Okay, so there are 3 things in it. The egg, which is immature, so this is called an oocyte. Now it can be a primary oocyte or a secondary oocyte, right? Then secondly, there are follicular cells surrounding the oocyte. Okay, for example here, this type of follicle is called the secondary follicle, and it has follicular cells surrounding the secondary oocyte in it. All right, so what's the use of the follicular cells? So it's just like, you know, the princess with the maidens that follow her, with the maids or the servants that follow her to serve her. Okay, so these follicular cells function to enclose and protect the oocyte inside. It also secretes the hormone estrogen to regulate the menstrual cycle. All right. Now, lastly, a follicle may have follicular fluid in the later stages, such as the graphene follicle here. It has fluid, all right, in one part of the follicle. So baby girls are born with 2 million primary oocytes that are each enclosed within a follicle. All right. So primary oocytes are enclosed in a follicle known as the primary follicle, right? Secondary oocytes are enclosed in the follicle called the secondary follicle that is bigger. And lastly, the biggest follicle of all is the Graafian follicle that contains fluid. And this Graafian follicle will burst at about the 14th day of the menstrual cycle and release the secondary oocyte into the fallopian tube. So there are three types of follicles that we're going to discuss: the primary follicle, which is the smallest, then the secondary follicle, and finally the Graafian follicle, which is the largest follicle. So the growth of the follicle is stimulated by a hormone called follicle stimulating hormone. So the name of this hormone tells us the function, right? And the short form is FSH, sounds like fish, okay? This is secreted from the pituitary gland in the brain, right? But its effect is on the follicles in the ovary. So let's find out more about the primary follicle, secondary follicle, and Graafian follicle. Let us discuss the development of the oocyte and the three types of follicles in the ovary during each menstrual cycle. So we start with the development of the oocyte, okay? So from birth to puberty, a girl will have a lot of these primary oocytes that have stopped at the stage of prophase 1 of meiosis 1, right? But at the time of puberty, when the girl attains puberty at 12 years old, around 12 years old, the primary oocyte completes meiosis 1. It resumes meiosis 1 and completes it to form the secondary oocyte. Then the secondary oocyte undergoes meiosis 2, but it stops at metaphase 2 of meiosis 2. Okay, so when it is in the secondary follicle and Graafian follicle until the time of ovulation, the oocyte inside the follicle is actually the secondary oocyte. And when it's released from the Graafian follicle during ovulation, this is the secondary oocyte at metaphase 2 of meiosis, at the stage of metaphase 2 of meiosis. Okay, now let's look at the development of the follicle during each menstrual cycle. Now, when the primary oocyte is in the ovary, it is surrounded by a layer of the follicular cells, right? And the whole structure is called the primary follicle. This whole structure is called the primary follicle, and it contains the primary oocyte at prophase 1 stage, all right? So when the primary oocyte completes meiosis 1 to form the secondary oocyte, which is a haploid cell, the first time that it's a haploid cell, the follicle, the primary follicle, also grows bigger and bigger, and there are more layers of follicular cells surrounding the oocyte now. So the primary follicle has developed to form the secondary follicle, okay? And the secondary follicle contains the secondary oocyte. So later on, the secondary follicle will continue to grow bigger, and it will form the Graafian follicle, which is the biggest follicle that contains follicular fluid in here. Now, sometimes the secondary follicle may have some follicular fluid too, okay? But the Graafian follicle is the biggest follicle. So as the secondary oocyte undergoes meiosis 2 and stops at the stage of metaphase 2, the secondary follicle is developing and growing bigger and becomes the Graafian follicle. So the Graafian follicle contains the secondary oocyte, secondary oocyte at metaphase 2. Graafian follicle contains the secondary oocyte at metaphase 2 stage of meiosis. Okay. Then after a few days, there is a ovulation. All right. So when ovulation occurs on the 14th day of the menstrual cycle, the secondary oocyte is released from the ovary, from the Graafian follicle in the ovary into the fallopian tube. All right. Because it bursts. All right. The Graafian follicle bursts and releases the secondary oocyte into the fallopian tube. So altogether, we see three types of follicles: the primary follicle containing the primary oocyte, the secondary follicle that contains the secondary oocyte, and then the Graafian follicle that contains the secondary oocyte at the stage of metaphase 2 of meiosis. Here's a quick summary of the three types of follicles in the ovary and the oocytes that are found in them. So the first type of follicle is the primary follicle, the second one is the secondary follicle, and the third is the Graafian follicle. Let's start with the primary follicle. The primary follicle in the ovary contains the primary oocyte, which has stopped at the prophase 1 stage of meiosis 1. So this primary follicle is formed in the female fetus while it is in the mother's uterus. And at birth, the baby girl will have many of these primary follicles that contain primary oocytes. So this stage will last for about 12 years until puberty is attained. Now, next, the primary follicle. In the primary follicle, the primary oocyte will then complete meiosis 1 when puberty is attained by the girl at about 12 years old. And in every menstrual cycle, one or a few of these primary follicles will develop. All right, the primary oocyte inside will also develop in every menstrual cycle that lasts 28 days. And how does the primary oocyte develop? It completes meiosis 1 to form the secondary oocyte. Okay, so primary oocyte is a diploid cell, but the secondary oocyte is a haploid cell. Now, next, when the primary oocyte completes meiosis 1, the follicle will have grown bigger, and this is called the secondary follicle. Secondary follicle is produced. Secondary follicle contains the secondary oocyte. And the secondary oocyte will undergo meiosis 2. It will start meiosis 2, but it stops at the metaphase 2 stage. Okay? So meiosis again stops at metaphase 2 stage. So as the secondary oocyte develops, the secondary follicle will also grow bigger, and it will become the Graafian follicle. So this is the biggest follicle of all. And the Graafian follicle contains the secondary oocyte at metaphase 2 stage. All right, it has not completed meiosis 2. So it's still called secondary oocyte. Now, the Graafian follicle will burst during ovulation on the 14th day of the menstrual cycle. This causes the secondary oocyte to be released from the Graafian follicle in the ovary into the fallopian tube. Next, what is the corpus luteum? Corpus luteum are remains of the Graafian follicle. It doesn't contain any oocyte, any secondary oocyte, because the oocyte has been released into the fallopian tube, right? So at puberty, one corpus luteum will develop per menstrual cycle, and if there's no fertilization, the corpus luteum at first grows bigger, but after a few days it degenerates, right? Then it will break down, okay, after about 10 days. But if fertilization occurs in the fallopian tube where the sperm fuses with the ovum, the nucleus of the sperm fuses with the nucleus of the ovum, then the corpus luteum will continue to grow due to stimulation by certain hormones. It will grow and it will continue to secrete progesterone, all right, for the pregnancy phase. So these are further notes on the follicles. Now, if you have understood the previous slides on the follicles and you want to skip this part, then go ahead, because we have already discussed this section earlier, all right? But if you want to copy the notes, then go ahead too. You can copy the notes here. So the three types of follicles. A layer of follicular cells envelopes the primary oocyte, as seen here, and the combined structure is called the primary follicle. So primary follicle consists of the follicular cells plus the primary oocyte inside. Next, the primary oocyte completes meiosis 1 to form the secondary oocyte. And this secondary oocyte is contained in a bigger follicle called the secondary follicle, which has more layers of follicular cells. Next, the secondary follicle develops further by growing bigger, and the follicle will be called the Graafian follicle. It will produce the bigger Graafian follicle. This Graafian follicle contains the secondary oocyte, and it also functions to release the hormone estrogen. Next is the process of ovulation. Okay, after the development of the follicles, ovulation occurs. So ovulation is the process whereby a mature Graafian follicle approaches the surface of the ovary here and releases the secondary oocyte into the fallopian tube. So one secondary oocyte is released into the fallopian tube every 28 days. That means in each menstrual cycle, right? Then the secondary oocyte, as seen here, is released and it will move through the fallopian tube. So this secondary oocyte or immature ovum only completes meiosis 2 if a sperm penetrates it in the fallopian tube. Alright? Because the secondary oocyte was at the stage of metaphase 2. But if a sperm penetrates it in the fallopian tube, then it will complete meiosis 2, and after that, an ovum and a polar body will be formed. Right? Next, the process of fertilization occurs whereby the nucleus of the sperm that has penetrated the ovum, penetrated the secondary oocyte, the nucleus of the sperm will fuse with the nucleus of the ovum to produce a diploid zygote. So the polar bodies that are formed will all die and disintegrate. Now, just now we discussed what happened in the fallopian tube when fertilization occurred, right? Now, how about the ovary? So another location or site is the ovary. We have to discuss what happens in the ovary after ovulation has occurred. Okay, that means after the graphene follicle has burst or ruptured and released the secondary oocyte into the fallopian tube. So what happens in the ovary after that? Now, after ovulation in the ovary, the graphene follicle will have some remains, okay, the leftover parts of the graphene follicle. So the remains of the graphene follicle, as seen here, the pink structure here, then forms the corpus luteum, right? So corpus luteum actually means dead body or yellow body, not dead body, yellow body, yellow dead body. Okay, corpus is a dead body, luteum means yellow. Okay, so it looks something like that. Think of a bunga raya flower, right, with the center part here in orange. Now, this corpus luteum is actually very important because it secretes the hormones progesterone and estrogen that help to regulate the menstrual cycle. We will study that in another video. So corpus luteum is formed, right? Now, there are two things that can happen to the corpus luteum. Okay, if there is no fertilization in the fallopian tube, the corpus luteum will degenerate or break down in the ovary after about 10 days. Okay, so if you're asked to draw the corpus luteum when there is no fertilization in the fallopian tube, you must draw that at first it is on the 14th day when it is formed, it is small, but it will first grow larger, right, and secrete the hormones progesterone, estrogen. Then if there is no fertilization, after about 10 days, it will break down, it will degenerate, so it becomes smaller and smaller, and then it probably disappears from the ovary. Okay, now if there's no fertilization in the fallopian tube, the secondary oocyte that started its journey in the fallopian tube will degenerate or break down and dies. So it will be moved into the uterus and then removed through menstruation when there's flow of blood and tissues coming out from the uterus. Okay, but if there's fertilization in the fallopian tube, right, hormones are released that cause the corpus luteum, stimulate the corpus luteum to continue to grow. So if you're going to draw the corpus luteum, if there's fertilization, it should be growing bigger and bigger and bigger, okay, for the next few months of the pregnancy. And it will secrete the hormones estrogen and progesterone during pregnancy to maintain and stimulate the thickness, the thickening of the endometrium in the uterus. We'll discuss that in another video. So here we can see the corpus luteum formed after ovulation has occurred. So at first it will definitely grow bigger, okay, whether there is or no fertilization. It grows bigger at first, but after a while, if there's no fertilization, the corpus luteum will degenerate, as seen here, right? And then that means it will break down. Now let us discuss the structure of the ovary. So it should be easier to understand as we have already discussed the three types of follicles. So this picture shows you a cross-section of the ovary, and in it we can see many primary follicles that contain primary oocytes that have stopped at the stage of prophase 1 of meiosis. So in every menstrual cycle that lasts 28 days, one or a few of these primary follicles will grow and develop, becoming bigger and bigger, right? So the primary follicle will grow bigger and bigger and have more layers of follicular cells, all right? So it will form the secondary follicle. It will develop into the secondary follicle. At the same time, the primary oocyte in it, the site here means that it's a cell, CYTE, cell, it's a cell. So the primary oocyte in the primary follicle will undergo and complete meiosis 1 to form the secondary oocyte. Thus, the secondary follicle contains the secondary oocyte. Next, the secondary follicle continues to grow bigger and it contains fluid in the center part here. So it becomes the Graafian follicle, which is the biggest follicle, and it is also called the mature follicle. At the same time, the secondary oocyte undergoes meiosis 2 but stops at metaphase 2 of meiosis. Right? So the Graafian follicle contains the secondary oocyte that has stopped at metaphase 2 of meiosis. Next, on the 14th day of the menstrual cycle, the Graafian follicle will rupture or burst. So the secondary oocyte will be released from the ruptured Graafian follicle during ovulation on the 14th day. So the secondary oocyte is released into the fallopian tube, and it may or may not be fertilized in the fallopian tube. Now what happens to the Graafian follicle? It will form the corpus luteum. Alright, so the corpus luteum are the remains of the ruptured Graafian follicle. It will start to develop and grow bigger and bigger, and it will secrete the hormones progesterone and estrogen. Okay, by the way, the Graafian follicle secretes what hormone? Estrogen. Okay, but the corpus luteum secretes progesterone and estrogen. Now next, if there's no fertilization in the fallopian tube, the corpus luteum will break down. It will degenerate. So it becomes smaller and smaller instead, right? So these are the phases in the development of the follicle and the corpus luteum. Of course, it's not always arranged in a circle like that. All right, this is just to show you the sequence of the different stages. Let's clear up the confusion of when meiosis occurs during oogenesis. So we know that meiosis does not occur continuously during oogenesis. So the question is, when does meiosis stop and then resume or start again during oogenesis, right? So meiosis 1 actually starts at the fetal stage in the primary oocyte, but it stops at the prophase 1 stage of meiosis, right? Then in the fetus and at birth and during the infant stage through the childhood stage until about 12 years, the primary oocytes are at the prophase 1 stage of meiosis and they remain dormant or inactive until 12 years later, about 12 years later, when the girl reaches puberty. Then meiosis 1 resumes at puberty about 12 years later from birth to produce the secondary oocyte. That means the primary oocyte will resume meiosis 1 and continue. Okay, from prophase 1, it will continue with metaphase 1, anaphase 1, and telophase 1 in order to produce the secondary oocyte. Next, secondary oocyte starts meiosis 2, okay, but it stops again, okay, at the metaphase 2 stage of meiosis 2, right? So here we see at puberty, the primary oocytes have complete meiosis 1 to form the secondary oocyte, but the secondary oocyte, it starts meiosis 2, but it stops again at the metaphase 2 stage, okay? Next, when does meiosis 2 resume and when is it completed? So meiosis 2 resumes and is completed only if the sperm penetrates the secondary oocyte that has been released into the fallopian tube, right? Sometimes they say at fertilization. Meiosis 2 resumes at fertilization. That means when the sperm penetrates the secondary oocyte, okay? And this will produce the ovum after meiosis 2 is completed. Next, we should be able to describe the structure of the female gametes. So let's discuss the structure of the Graafian follicle, which contains the female gamete. Right? So the Graafian follicle is the biggest follicle in the ovary, and it contains three things. Firstly, the secondary oocyte, the cell in yellow. Secondly, the follicular cells, the cells in purple, and then the follicular fluid in the center part of the cell. So it looks like the graphene follicle looks like a one-eyed smiling giant with a big smile here. That will help you to remember, how to recognize the graphene follicle. So it consists of these three things. So let's talk about the secondary oocyte first. The secondary oocyte is the female gamete. It is a large immature haploid egg cell surrounded by the follicular cells, right? So haploid means that it has only one set of chromosomes. Now, why is the secondary oocyte so big? Alright, or why is the ovum the largest cell in the body? Okay, if you ask that question, then you can answer like this. The secondary oocyte or ovum contains a lot of cytoplasm which has food reserves or nutrients for the developing zygote and embryo. Before the embryo reaches the uterus to be implanted and to get food from the mother, right? So it has to travel through the fallopian tube. If fertilization has occurred and the embryo is already produced, it has to travel through the fallopian tube and it will be dividing all the time, right? So it will need food reserves and nutrients to develop. Okay, that's why the secondary oocyte contains a lot of cytoplasm and nutrients inside it. All right, and it's the biggest cell in the body. Now, what about the follicular cells? What's their function? So they protect the secondary oocyte, and they also secrete a hormone called estrogen, which is involved in the menstrual cycle to regulate it. Now, when the graphene follicle has burst and released the secondary oocyte, let's look at how the secondary oocyte looks like, okay, when ovulation has occurred. So this is the secondary oocyte with its nucleus and cytoplasm. And then it has a plasma membrane surrounding it, and the blue coat here is called the jelly coat. Now, the interesting thing is there's one other cell, smaller cell at the side here called the first polar body. So as we know, when the primary oocyte undergoes meiosis 1 and then divides to form two cells, it will produce the secondary oocyte and the first polar body. Okay, so the first polar body is just beside the secondary oocyte here. Alright, but it will degenerate and die later. Right, that's all for this lesson. Thanks for viewing, and please do share, like and subscribe to my channel. Take care and goodbye for now.